today brings a film. The 19th row of the latest Russian thriller horror movies of 2022. It all started with an accident 20 years ago. On a plane in the dark and windy night, a girl is awakened by sudden cries. Her mother is not with her. The plane starts to shake violently. The girl was so frightened that she clung to her seat. Behind her came the sound of a scurrying voice. She looked back and saw a witch with long hair. The girl looked at her steadily. Suddenly, after the plane crashed in Novosibirsk, the girl was the only one who survived, walking through a strange forest covered in blood. After this, the chase quickly took off. But the cause is still unknown. 20 years have passed since then. The little girl had become a family man. But the story of her miraculous survival has been followed by journalists. A woman called Katrin. She is now an accomplished psychotherapist. And it's because of this job, she has moved on from the trauma of her past. During the interview, Nana, her daughter, also said they will be flying to visit their grandfather tomorrow. The next day, the daytime flight was cancelled due to a snowstorm. The mother and daughter were forced to take the last overnight flight. In addition to them, there was an elderly couple on the plane, and a handsome man, Li Ku. In the front cabin are Wang, a businessman, and Pai, a freelance painter. While waiting for takeoff, Katrin was already showing signs of nervousness, but the old woman in the back seat was scared first. She was making a lot of noise and wanted to get off the plane. Catlin rushed over to her and tried to talk her through the situation. He finally handed him 2 pieces of candy. She took them and settled down. But she hadn't recovered herself. The candy was all that was needed to keep her going in the nick of time. The plane was about to take off. Catherine was urged to get back to her seat. But at that moment, it was her mother's voice at the door. Everything was the same as when she was a child. The sound of her mother's nagging voice echoed in her ears. But when she opened the door again, she was back on the plane. As she walked back to her seat, behind her, there was the sound of a machine grinding. Caitlin followed the sound. Apart from being startled by the stewardess, he didn't notice anything unusual. The plane had taken off. Catlin sat motionless in his seat. He didn't even pay attention to Rick's conversation next door. It wasn't until after the flight was smooth. Catlin sighed in relief. She turned to Leek and apologized for her attitude. After some small talk, he went to sleep with his daughter in his arms. In the money room, the merchant king sipped his expensive whiskey. As there was no one else around, he noticed the strange movements of the painter next door. The old king could not help but complain a little and then ignore him. Just after everyone had gone to bed, an accident occurred. The whole cabin turned red instantly. The cabin crew sat there like robots. Carter went back to his childhood in his sleep. While eating with his mother, she looked in the mirror and saw her mother covered in blood. And then she remembered. Her mother had been killed in a chase accident. But when she was asked about her mother, she said that the plane had just hit turbulence. With that, she turned her back. When Katrin heard the sound of the machine grinding again, Mom was behaving strangely. Katrin was in a trance when she realized, in her dream, her mother's eyes were like a witch's, had turned white. Just then, the plane hit a bit of turbulence. It began to sway erratically. As the old man in the back was comforting his wife, suddenly he had a heart attack and fainted. All the people on the plane gathered around. Caitlin asked Rick to help with CPR. But as she leaned over and was about to give artificial respiration, the scene shifted. The old man was still lying there, but his breathing was very weak. His body began to twitch. But Katrin was being held down by a mysterious force. She didn't move. Blood begins to seep from the seat at the far end. The old man twitched a few times and then he was gone. Before anyone knew it, the plane hit a powerful turbulence. Katrin tried to protect her daughter, but the flight attendant pinned her down in the nearest seat. She shouted for her daughter to put on her oxygen mask and take deep breaths. And just then, Katrin's consciousness flashed back 20 years to the time of the accident. But in a matter of seconds, it was back to reality. When the plane was stable, she rushed over and held her daughter tightly. Then Katrin told Rick. The force that had just held her down came from a witch 20 years ago. Although she made it sound like it was. But Leek just thought it was a drugged up. It was a hallucination. Katrin tried to convince him. She told him what had happened to her when she was 7 years old. From the beginning to the end. What's even more bizarre is that the scar on her leg from when she was 7 was gone. As he talked, his daughter Nana kept staring at the back seat. When her mother asked her about it, Catherine became less calm. She hugged her daughter tightly. At the same time, the flight attendant informed her that due to turbulence, the plane was changing its route. The closest airport was Machivo. This is exactly where the plane was shown to be 20 years ago. The minutes ticked by. Right above the old king's seat, a bottle of ethanol solution was poured. It was passed along the gap to his feet. And at that moment, because of the change of route, a depressed old Wang couldn't resist taking out a cigarette. Before Ping and Catelyn had time to stop them, while the guys were busy trying to save the others, Catelyn noticed the eyes in the depths of the fire. The witch is at work again. By the time the fire was out, the old king had been burnt to a crisp. And that's not all. Her daughter Nana was sitting in the back, but Catherine couldn't see her. She just looked out the window and saw herself a day earlier, before she left on this flight. Catherine thought about not going there at all. After she'd calmed her daughter down to sleep, there was the sound of machinery grinding in her ears again. Looking out of the cat's eye, a dark shadow flashed. In a flash, her daughter Nana was gone. The whole house began to shake violently. The scene shifts. Catherine was back on the plane. On the other side, the old king was dying. Catherine gets a first aid kit and tries to help, but looking across the room, Pi was still in the mood to paint. Suddenly, he starts to go berserk. Luckily, Rick was there to stop him. Catherine slowly calmed down. Behind him was the sound of the old king moaning in pain. He stretched out his hand as if to express something. At that moment, Pi remembered the pictures of his family on his phone. After giving them to him, he slowly closed his eyes. There was a series of accidents on the plane. No one was in a calm mood. Catherine had just sat down. Suddenly, remembered that the old woman had just gone to the bathroom alone. She hadn't come out yet. She rushed out and frantically smashed the door. But when the steward took the key and opened the door, there was no one there. The strange thing is, the stewardesses. From the beginning, the steward thought that Catherine had nothing better to do. She said a few words to her and went on to other things. And that's when a million black hands were holding her down. As she struggled, Catherine noticed the number 19 above her head. When the black claws disappeared, Catherine got up to find an eerie figure behind the front hatch. As she rushed to hold her daughter, Rick, too, inexplicably shed tears of blood. And that's not all. Even the stewardess who had come to help suddenly started spraying water. It was as if she had fallen into the water and drowned alive. What's even more unbelievable is that Pi, who had been sitting in the front row, had drawn a picture of the stewardess drowning. Catherine found it and grabbed the book. It wasn't just the stewardess. Pi had drawn every scene Catherine had seen, including the figure behind the front hatch. The next moment, what the hell is going on here? When Appy disappeared, there was only a mother and daughter left on the plane, and the last stewardess. And Rick, with blood in his eyes. But soon both of them were also in trouble. Everyone died and disappeared. Catherine crashed through the door with all her strength. And all he saw were rows of seats again. Onwards through the second door and still the same. The third and the fourth. Behind each door was the same sight. Until she entered a place where there was a lot of light. Only then did she realize that everything before her was a lie. Her daughter, who had been next to her, had strangely appeared next to her in the front seat. It was the dark figure. Just as Catherine rushed past, all the memories of her childhood came back to her. It turned out that the witch from 20 years ago, so that young Catelyn wouldn't have to see death with her own eyes. So she cast a spell to hypnotize her. But to her surprise, Catherine had a strong will in her body. She had been fighting against the memory. That's how the experience on the plane came about. The film ends with the plane before the crash. On the plane that day, the old man had a heart attack and died. It was Catherine's mother who ran to his aid. After the plane crash, Catherine cries out and crawls to her mother, but she was accidentally knocked unconscious by debris. It was a kindly uncle who carried mother and daughter to the 19th row of seats and fastened their seatbelts. He himself was shot in the head and died. The plane crashed into a lake. Apart from the mother and daughter, everyone else on the plane died. That's the end of the film. In fact, from the beginning to the end, there was no such thing as a plane 20 years later. It was all a hypnotic vision that Catherine was struggling with. Every person she meets, they were all victims of the accident. In the end, the heroine saves her mother and redeems herself. And that's today's story. If you like the video, please like it and leave a comment. We'll see you tomorrow.